for several decades now. But what is new is a genre of music originating from Trinidad that is so closely linked to gang violence that the artists themselves, many of them have already been killed or attacked, and people around them have been killed. In one case, one artist escaped death twice, but there are many bodies around him of bystanders or collateral damage, you know, to some extent unintentional, but therein lies the problem, right? And of course, the thought is young and impressionable minds with regards to violent lyrics, you know, it encourages them to be violent. Now, traditionally speaking, these arguments or similar arguments have existed since, I don't know, the 60s, the 70s, 50s, right? With regards to art that pushes boundaries of what is deemed to be moral standards of the day. Granted, it wasn't always, directly speaking, lyrics that directly reference violence. However, in the 90s, in the early 2000s, you know, that argument with regards to direct displays of violence became more prevalent, right? Now it wasn't just, ooh, rock music is the devil music. No, now it is the lyrics, you know, NWA, video games, some movies. How much is it encouraging behavior? Statistically speaking, the correlation is insignificant. Because if this was a causation of any statistical significance, then given the widespread consumption of these types of entertainment media, we would see significantly more violence from young people. However, I would, at this point in time, say I can't necessarily discount the violent lyrics in Trinidad music not having some sort of effect. And now I do wonder if it's not just the music itself, but the fact that the societal structure isn't robust enough to have our young people, to some extent, be exposed to things like this and not be influenced to the extent that they are or seemingly are currently. And that is to say, it's one thing if you hear music that glorifies violence and gang life, etc., etc. But then it's another thing to have that impression put upon you in an environment where the laws seemingly has a hard time even finding out the identity of perpetrators, much less punishing them appropriately. They, you know, 13% is the detection rate. That means 87% is the escape rate, is the get out of jail free rate. It is the we will never discover their identity rate. And given those odds, the impression has an easier time taking hold. Now, the Prime Minister was looking at things like establishing a commission or some sort of body that could give parents help. Part of it is the current environment of raising children. The challenges are greater. Of course, single-parent homes is a phenomenon that's probably becoming more and more common as time goes on. This was not something that existed, say, in the 50s or 40s to the extent that it is now. Not to say that they didn't have absentee parents, right? But I think the Prime Minister is correct in saying at the end of the day, what we're taking for granted is no longer there. And we hear it all the time. It takes a village. Where is the village? And to some extent, is the village even appropriate now, given how society is? It might not be so simple as to say, well, let's just get the village back. Is the village members appropriate role models and guardians and guides for our young people? Because some of the communities that our young people live in, at the end of the day, at times, not always, but at times, the young people kind of make it out. And that's a story that, to some extent, unfortunately, is celebrated, making it out of certain communities. But the Prime Minister also pointed out the fact that, hey, so we have schools, government builds these schools, large compounds that can be utilized after 3 p.m. Now, teachers do utilize them for private lessons. Make what of that you will. But he was looking to the fact that society could make more use of these schools. Now, they already have use of these schools to some extent, but I think it's maybe not necessary to the degree that the Prime Minister is suggesting. Looking to increase engagement and contact hours with youths and older people, professionals, non-professionals, create a society where the concerns about crime can be to some extent discussed and met by the members of society and not just politicians on political platforms. And that's all well and good, but part of the problem that we have now is that parents just don't have the time most of the time, right? That's why they're not necessarily present. The first objective is to pay the bills, and children are not cheap. So then, unfortunately, what slips through the cracks is engagement with your own children. Unfortunately. That's why there's so many activities and lessons and et cetera, et cetera. But, to be fair, we do wonder what are community centers for, so you could probably lump that in as well. Part of the issue is we hear stories about community centers being controlled by the people in the community who think they own the centers, and it's not actually being utilized to the extent that it could to help foster community. And part of that is having a space for young people to, one, be safe, but two, to also have activities to engage them so that positive role models could be part of their lives. And okay, if community centers ain't working out, I don't know why, because we keep spending money on them, so I don't know if we should let them get away scot-free with this. But then also there are the schools. Of course, the flip side to that is the principals would be very much concerned about what may or may not be happening on their compound that could potentially damage the school facilities when they obviously do not want to be there late into the afternoon when they have to be at work at school from early in the morning, which is understandable. But they're responsible for the grounds, so then now initiatives like this might need further thought with regards to responsibility and liability for the school compound. And that would be, a whole host of other rules and regulations and procedures and policies that might need to be looked at, tweaked a little bit from the Ministry of Education side. Because remember, it's not as though we have this unlimited budget to fix schools if anything is broken. We already don't have enough money to properly maintain the schools that we have or to finish the ones planned or under construction. So it's a dynamic situation, but I do applaud the seed of the idea that the Prime Minister has. He does say initiatives are coming, they're being thought out, they're being considered. We'll have to wait and see, because there was an initiative of $100 million for communities, and we're still waiting to even hear what it might look like. Right? Which makes me think more and more that was just something they added in last minute and they didn't actually have a plan for, and they're still trying to figure that out. Can they figure this out, or maybe the $100 million will be redirected here? That wouldn't necessarily be too bad, depending on what your objective is. But let's take a break. And when we come back, we'll get into the other topics of the daily review. There's a follow-up with regards to what is ending up being a big story this week. I don't necessarily know we anticipated it being big, but our diets, I think perhaps maybe this is a good thing, is more and more coming to the forefront. Stay tuned to Talking About on WSN, your content capital. We'll be right back.
FanZone, your reliable, authentic supplier, has just gotten better. You can now visit our website www.fanzonett.com for your authentic wear and collectibles. The only place where you can use both your Visa debit and credit cards. Visit our website fanzonett.com to make your purchase today.
Take some time for yourself or spend some time with the family at Sandy Point Village Hotel. Enjoy our various studio and suite apartments, self-contained with their own kitchenettes and Wi-Fi. We also have our famous 100-foot swimming pool and our beachfront restaurant, The Steak and Lobster Grill. And our location in Crown Point puts us near the center of activity from the nylon pool to the local nightlife. Call us and make your reservations at 639-8533, 389-2378 or email us at sandypointvillagehotel@gmail.com.
And we're back here on Talking Point, and a topic that has, at least to some extent, grown some legs over the course of the week, that is with regards to our consumption of unhealthy, overprocessed foods, like fast food, as well as our consumption of sugary drinks. Primarily sodas. I think most people, when you hear about ultra-sweetened, super-sweetened, highly sweetened, sugary drinks, you think of sodas, you think of soft drinks. But that could potentially also include certain brands of juices, because, you know, a lot of juices, what is the stereotype? It's mostly sugar water with a little bit of juice flavor. Now, after the minister made his statements, the Diabetes Association has come out, and I guess you could say that they're looking to take advantage of the momentum or the fact that the minister brought up the discussion, and they are looking at measures to kind of discourage the consumption of unhealthy food and beverages, right? And what they're looking at, I think it's twofold. One, taxes. You put taxes on these things, and it in theory discourages it, but I think in reality, taxes on goods like this don't necessarily discourage the behavior. It'll increase the price, so maybe it might put a price barrier a little bit. But what tends to happen is it's more of a revenue generating thing. I'm not saying it's as addicting as a cigarette, but I think perhaps we should consider the taxation of cigarettes and tobacco maybe being the result of any taxation on fast food and sugary drinks, as opposed to a discouraging measure. And then the other thing was potentially limiting advertising of these things. Now, throughout the week, Mr. Shah, Kita Shah, we've spoken about this because the minister made these statements on Monday. We spoke about it on Tuesday, pointing to the fact that there are economic ramifications with regards to the fast food industry and the importation of, you know, some of the raw materials, right? Whether it is from Latin America, because I believe one or two of the fast food chains might be tied to the Latin American region of the global fast food brand, and others might be tied to North America. We don't necessarily import everything, but the profits or the franchise fees do have to go abroad in US currency. And of course, Karen, Teixeira was with me yesterday. She also pointed out the fact that not just withstanding the costs of the franchises, but also there's the fact that the industries, to what extent do they really provide employment? To what extent do they really, help the economy develop? Because these are mostly entry-level jobs with very little upward mobility. One in every, couple of dozen workers may become a manager of a fast food outlet, which in and of itself, at least in TNT, I don't think is that great of a job, all things considered. And these are not jobs that are heavily subscribed by our population. It seems as though to some extent they don't want these jobs if they can help it, if our people can help it. So the Diabetes Association is calling for these measures, or at least measures like this, because I guess, to be fair to them, they're seeing the results and they agree with the minister. Unfortunately, and maybe I shouldn't say this unfortunately, because the situation, or let me put it this way, unfortunately, the situation might be more complex than we think, because the minister has come out and said, after the Diabetes Association made their call, that no measures really are being considered. Depending on what you read, it almost seems as though that the statement he made was somewhat in the affirmative. Not that they're not being considered, but it might be so far as to say no such policy will be considered. Meaning that that he's saying it's not on the table and we won't put it on the table for consideration. And so I'm not entirely sure what the context was. I don't necessarily want to go too deep into this because this is a bit of a, well, the stance that he's taking, I don't know if it's a stance he has to take or if it's a stance that he naturally is making just based on his judgment. And when I say has to take, this was alluded to particularly in our call-in segment yesterday, where, some people brought a question, the fact that, listen, what about the interests behind, the business interests behind these franchises? And even Karen was saying this, as much as she was saying that we need to limit them in some way, I don't think she mentioned necessarily taxes, but limit them in some way. She wasn't saying for them to be, regulated out of existence. They still should be allowed to exist and to operate. But the impacts that they have potentially are negative in more ways than one. So the minister comes out and says, well, no such thing is being considered or will be considered. To some extent, I suspect that it's because he wanted to make this call. He wanted to, at the very least, try to speak to the population about the situation, about the need for change. And it's not necessarily new messaging. He did this before COVID. Others have been doing this from even before COVID, definitely during COVID as food security became an issue. But I suspect that he knows it's going to be like if he's trying to swim uphill, if he brings this to cabinet and it's not going to go anywhere, because the various interests, those who follow politics know, to some extent, especially with the PNM and its formalized structures and interconnected parts, different people have different interests. Let's just put it that way. But also there's the fact that is government prepared now to take the baton from the minister who's currently running the race alone and swim uphill as a whole on an issue that might be difficult to push through. Because to some extent, some of the franchises could argue we've been operating for however many years. We're not the only culprits with regards to the eating habits of the population, right? What about other food establishments that may or may not be offering just as unhealthy foods, not just fried foods, but foods with a lot of sugar added to it, foods with a lot of starch and a lot of processed foods, a lot of fatty foods. We're not the only game in town that's unhealthy. Generally speaking, eating out usually is unhealthy because you eat, taste and to some extent affordability are usually the priority over health, right? And how that's determined really much depends on the individual establishment and their business plan and who their target market is. Healthier foods have been introduced to the market and new business models around the world have been introduced. Marketing towards those who want healthier options, those things tend to be more expensive, significantly more, right? And it's no different here. So the situation is not so straightforward, I think, where we could just regulate fast food and soft drinks and it'll go away. And then, because of that, those businesses could say, why are we being treated in this manner? What about the rest of the food and beverage industry? And I think that's fair. I think that's fair, and I appreciate the fact that I suspect the ministers, he's not necessarily, I don't think he necessarily looked at all the business implications when he made those statements. He's coming from a health perspective. It's not necessarily his job to have to do that. But the business implications and the implications on the economy, they are a bit more complex. He did mention with regards to the fact that these businesses are providing jobs. Now, again, I will say this, I do wonder to what extent will we as a society be losing out if we limit fast food franchises? How many jobs will we be talking about that might potentially be lost if certain measures are adopted? And to some extent, is it worth protecting those jobs? I'm not entirely sure. Statistical analysis in TNT is very difficult because we tend to not have a good enough library of statistical data from which we could then do said analysis. So this is just one of those things that's not so simple. But let me leave this here. Let's move on to the next topic. Coming out of the meeting in Guyana, or the meetings, I guess you could say, the conferences, more details from the regional ferry service has been brought to light. Now, the Prime Minister did state the obvious, they need more than the galleon's passage. But with regards to the regional ferry service, there seems to be 2 new countries looking to join in. That is Grenada and Suriname, I believe. So the numbers currently stands to 6 nations. That's TNT, Barbados, Guyana, Suriname, Grenada, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And what was interesting was, because we've heard regional ferry service for food security, but then to some extent we already have cargo ships, conducting trade, because one of the things when the volcano happened in St. Vincent, we were, at least if you weren't aware before, you should have been aware by that point in time that we import ground provisions and other locally grown food stuff from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So we already have that to some degree. But one of the things that the Prime Minister was referencing in his media briefing was the fact of getting basically agricultural materials, I think it's soya and corn, to make feedstock for our local animal agriculture industries, whether it's for chickens, etc., etc. Because we import that. And one of the things he said was, I think we are not necessarily aware to what extent the food import bill is literally just raw materials to make feed for our animal produce or animal agriculture operations. And they're looking potentially to utilize suppliers from Guyana and maybe Brazil in order to bring the raw materials, the raw products to TNT, which TNT could then turn into the finished product for our chicken farms and beef and pig farms, etc., etc., which economically would be better off, and of course we would, have more trade with more regional partners, particularly, I guess, Guyana. And this ferry service, I guess, is to add the extra cargo capacity for that. So potentially, this means that they were looking at things in the long run, and at least we hope the implication is true. They were looking at things in the long run. It's just that they didn't necessarily tell us what their specific target was. Because I think this, again, I didn't necessarily want to completely discount or discredit the idea when the Minister of Foreign Affairs said food security, but we didn't necessarily see what was the whole point of the situation. Why do we need to just make a whole new ferry service when cargo ships go between islands anyway? But if it is to provide specific capacity to do specific functions that could help with regional food security, so to make our animal farms, I guess you could say, less dependent on American imported feed stock products, then all right, let's see how this turns out. It's sounding good so far, but like the Prime Minister said, the galleon's passage ain't it. We need more. And he pointed out, especially with now 6 countries potentially being involved, in order to have a schedule that is practical, makes sense, we'll need more boats, we'll need bigger boats. So let's see how that unfolds. Moving on now, the Prime Minister also pointed to the fact that there's another potential buyer to the refinery. It seems as though every time they go to an energy conference, the Prime Minister, well, I guess you could say he peddles his wares. We have a refinery, folks. It's not necessarily brand new, but it's available for somebody to buy. Now, at the end of the day, I'll kind of believe this when I see this. Also coming out of the whole CARICOM heads of government meeting is the fact that the whole single market economy, I guess you could say, that is also being looked at, pointing to the fact that, A, we need to open things up more. We've kind of dropped the ball on this situation, and it seems as though they're going to push further for it. One of those things is to open up the freedom of movement with regards to persons, but also potentially to reduce tariffs. And going back to the previous story with regards to the ferry service, also for that, tariffs with regards to that smaller collection of companies, internal trade tariffs, are also being looked at to be reduced. So this energy conference / CARICOM heads of government meeting potentially maybe might have been quite a productive use of the Prime Minister's time. But with regards to the refinery, I'll believe it when I see it. Because a lot of people, yeah, we're interested, and then when they get the particular details with regards to all of the burdens, debt that the refinery is saddled with, the age of the refinery, the fact that it's been in mothballs, so how much capital would have to be used to bring it back up to scratch. But I think it's a good sign. CARICOM potentially is looking at itself and taking itself even more seriously. We already saw glimpses of that happening, but hopefully we'll see some actualization, realization of those sentiments. All right, let's take a break. When we come back, we will have my guest, Opposition Senator Jayanti Lakshmi, going back to national security, because I have some concerns, and it just so happens she's on the Joint Select Committee of National Security. Stay tuned. This is Talking Point on WSN. We'll be right back after this.
My name is Carl Media. I am the founder and the host of Ever Increasing Voice Ministries. Join me every Saturday and Sunday on WESN, this powerful station, at 9 a.m. on Saturdays, 1 p.m. and 7 p.m. nightly. Also on Sundays, I'll be on at 7 a.m., 1 p.m. and 7 p.m. at night time. When you come here, we are getting people heavenly ready.
This is Face of Sports, WESN Content Capital. How you felt about the kiss on the lip?
That's the business. I'm nothing to do with that.
And I find that was distasteful.
The national senior team, whether you like it or not, that is the model for all other teams to follow.
I'm assuming that the regional requirement may be a much stricter requirement.
This is not about Pro League and Super League. This is a league run by the Normalization Committee that I'm responsible for.
Nobody expected FIFA to fund this arrangement.
If we don't get a professional attitude towards this, we are doomed for failure.
You break the balance, trip the leg, control the body.
They ain't gonna stand put forever.
Why you want the Chiefs to lose so? Why you want the Chiefs to lose so?
They already have two. Lamar don't
Why?
have.
You're jealous because you know the Chiefs getting closer to the Patriots. Let's go to the last part.
No,
of this game.
no.
Let's go to the last part.
Join me, Dr. Nalini Kokram, on What's Up Doc, where we discuss all your burning questions concerning health.
Trinidad and Tobago is among one of the highest risk group of patients that develop this form of genetic breast cancer.
What I'd like to take home from a short interview like this, screening. You must screen.
Because it's silent.
It's silent.
Yeah.
And because it's silent, you don't know it's there.
What's Up Doc, every Tuesday and Thursday on WESN, Content Capital.
Welcome back to Talking Point, ladies and gentlemen. And in the current situation of our crime problems, escalating problems, one of the things that I have been pointing towards, and Talking Point has been pointing towards for quite some time, is our border security. And, quite some time ago, we did have Senator Damian Leiter speaking about the state of Coast Guard vessels. But one of the things coming out of the last Joint Select Committee on National Security is there were some questions about how the police service was being operated with officers not paying, taking instructions to heed. So I have further questions with regards to what potentially the Joint Select Committee can do with regards to the other protective services, transparency and accountability for them, because they have their responsibilities too. So joining me, of course, is Opposition Senator Jayanti Lakshmi. Senator, good morning. Thank you for joining us once again.
Hi, good morning, and good morning to all of your viewers. Thanks for having me once more.
So I guess one of the things is with regards to joint select committees, some people might make the mistake that it's very much the same thing that we see maybe in the United States. I don't know if maybe you could just give us a basic description of what is the Joint Select Committee, at least on national security. You know, what is its role? What can it or can it not do?
Right. So basically, the Joint Select Committees, we have the power to make inquiries and to report. And those reports are, of course, laid in the Parliament and they become part of the official records of the Parliament. In the United States, you would see, for example, when certain appointments and so on are being made, people come before, let's say, the Senate or something like that, and you're allowed to be questioned, and your actual fitness to hold a particular office depends on getting a vote at the end of the day from, you know, the senators or the House or whoever it is, probably one of the committees. So they have committees on foreign affairs who would be allowed to meet and examine their foreign ambassadors or their and things like that. We don't have that, so it's a little bit different from that U.S. system. I quite like the U.S. system where you're allowed to question people who are going to hold public office, though. That might be something that we should actually look at adopting in relation to the Commissioner of Police, because the notification and the recommendation of who the Police Service Commission recommends for the position of Commissioner and Deputy Commissioners comes to the Parliament and there's a debate. But the person isn't actually there. What you get is the CV. The House of Representatives gets the CV of the person, and they're allowed to raise, you know, the government puts forward certain things, and you'd have seen, curiously, in the last session that they had of that nature, that the government put forward the nomination of someone and then they voted against it. And questions have been asked, and even the Police Welfare Association has asked questions and no answers forthcoming. And that really is a weakness, I believe, in our system. We have opportunities to ask questions, but we don't necessarily get the answers, and that is something that and then of course we have the 10-day or the 7-day news cycle, and things just fall off the radar. So the Joint Select Committee on National Security, as it stands right now, what we're allowed to do is to inquire into policies. Government's responsible for making policies, and so they can come up with a policy like, we're going to allocate $1 million in the budget for new police vehicles, because that's how we're going to tackle crime. All right, I think something like that was said in last budget. I can't remember the exact figure, if it was $1 million or something else. And we're allowed then to ask questions about, let's say, so if that's your policy that you need more vehicles, but what about the maintenance of vehicles? What about these things? You have to look at the, you know, how agencies are working together, how efficiently these things are being utilized, whether the policy is sufficient. If you have a policy that you're buying 1 million vehicles, but the vehicles aren't suitable. I will give you an example. I had a matter once in a magistrate's court. I think it was in Sipario. And there was another matter simultaneously taking place, and it would always call together with mine. So I started to almost follow this matter religiously. And it had to do with a large quantity of marijuana. And that case dragged through the system for more than a year because the police in that district did not have a vehicle of the appropriate size to go to the Forensic Science Center and collect the exhibit. I'm telling you, I kid you not. And I sat there in horror thinking to myself, I wish I could tape these things and record them, because I feel like these things just don't register anymore. And when we, and again, a weakness in the committee is that when we sit and we question policy, people who aren't in the system necessarily, like parliamentarians, and who don't have the practical experience of knowing that these things actually happen, may listen and say, okay, well, $1 million, and they're buying, 25 new this vehicle or that vehicle or whatever. We don't know. And I think that one of the things that the committee intends to do shortly is to meet with some of the divisional commanders, not necessarily the executive, just the commissioner and deputies. And I think that will allow us an opportunity to drill down and get into the operational aspects of the TTPS and to find out a little bit more about whether or not on an operational level these policies are actually working. Because policies sound wonderful on paper, and they sound wonderful when you announce them in a budget and at a press conference. But operationally, I don't know if they're working, and our crime statistics certainly suggest that some things aren't working very well.
Now, one thing I do just want to clarify, because you said the government put forward a name for DCP and then they voted against it. Isn't it that they're just putting forward the merit list that the supposedly independent commission of inquiry, I know I'm couching it and I'm putting my bias in, but I've already stated this multiple times, so it is what it is, right?
But
at the end of the day, they're just presenting the merit list. And what was, at the very least, curious was the minister used flowery language for the individual before he and his peers shut him down.
He sort of put forward the recommendation, but it's more than that. I believe that the list, the JSC sends the merit list and the recommended names to the cabinet, and then the cabinet notifies the president, who will then send it to the parliament. So if there was an issue involving the particular individual, I would have thought that would have been dealt with beforehand, or that they would have raised the issue frontally in putting the name forward. They could have, and this is something that I raised as well when the last merit list went missing.
Yeah.
That even the president, in her very, I thought, poorly drafted, and I'm sorry to say, I mean no disrespect to the office, but I have to say it was a very poorly drafted explanation and statement with regarding that merit list fiasco, saying that, well, what was I supposed to do if someone raised issues about a person who is on the merit list and whose the notification is being sent? You're supposed to send it to the parliament. That's supposed to be something that we should be informed of, even if it is a matter that cannot be publicly dealt with. There are mechanisms in place that we should allow this, but you don't come to the parliament, present the CV, present the notification as a minister, speak in your, unnecessarily sometimes flowery terms about the individual, and put forward a recommendation that the House recommend and accept this notification, and then you turn around and you just vote against it because something surfaces in the middle of the debate. I mean, how is that? To me, it's not just unfair to the parliamentarians who are asked to vote, but it's also very unfair to the individual.
Curiously, there were only 3 slots and 4 names, so I do wonder if it was pre-planned and the execution was just kind of not the most elegant way to do what they did.
Not well thought out.
Now,
of course, yes.
With that said, one of the things you said before I asked the previous question was with regards to getting the district commanders, or I guess you could say the field commanders. Divisional commanders, sorry. And not the executive. So that leads me to another question, which will actually get to one of the matters that I'm most curious in. What authority do you have to call on people? Like, who could you call? Could you insist? Could you compel?
You can't necessarily compel the parliaments. We have secretarial support through the parliament staff, and they will write and invite people to appear. Generally speaking, there is compliance with those requests. Questions are sent beforehand to solicit certain information that the committee will agree to based on the proposal and the scope of the inquiry. And when we get that information, then we call them before us, and we would then be allowed to question them. I have not seen in my time there, which has been very short, much reluctance to appear. What I have seen, however, is that when we broadly invite, let's say, the TTPS, so we want to question a particular agency, you get the top. And I really don't feel like that is the most useful for a committee, because like I said before, you get a very different picture, I think, when you drill down. And one of the things we want to hear from the divisional commanders is about what's working and what's not. And so actually, we're hoping that we can find out, what are some of the things that are working in different areas.
Is it that you usually just have a general request and the executive decides, well, we don't want other people to speak, we will speak? Or have you all individually named people in the past?
Most of the time we would invite the organization, and we would write to the head of the organization, and it's really up to them who they wish to have attend the meeting. So on other committees that I sit on, apart from national security, for example, we would be interviewing the EMA, and they may wish to bring their head of legal because the scope of the inquiry might be the usefulness of their legislation and that sort of thing. So they would usually submit beforehand the names of the persons they're sending, but we don't really drill down into an organization and say, that officer who sits there, we want to particularly have them come before us or something like that. But in this case, I believe the divisional commanders would have a somewhat practical experience in terms of the execution of policies. And so I'm very, very much hoping that, that particular session, which is due to happen shortly, would be very useful for us to drill down a little bit into the execution of the policies and what's working for them in different areas and so on. And to hear a little bit more about their, resources, resource constraints, a collaboration with other agencies. I want to get some more of that. One of the things that we mentioned when we talk about is the performance of the executive at the last hearing. And I have to say, I was really disappointed in how unprepared they came to answer questions. Because you know beforehand what we would have asked before. And a lot of things that I asked particularly were follow-up questions. I asked for follow-up on investigations into the appearance of marked ammunition on crime scenes. I asked for follow-up in terms of collaboration with customs, because we know that the guns are coming through the legal ports of entry due to the fact that, you know, we don't have proper scanners running on the port. I've asked, and I couldn't get statistics. I couldn't get basic information. I was sort of, yes, we're working with customs. Well, how many joint exercises have you conducted? Well, I'll have to get back to you on that. Like, don't you think that that's just basic information, that if you're coming to a committee to report on something and to report on your successes or your lack thereof in terms of particular things, you would want to say, well, we conducted 4 joint exercises, we were able to recover X amount of firearms at customs, this is what's happened, the cases before the court. That's just a simple breakdown that I would expect.
I think you would have, at the very least, expected to be prepared to deflect, but it seems as though they weren't necessarily even prepared for that. And that whole situation leads me to one of the things that I really wanted to get into, because we saw the police executive, even at times with regards to body cameras and with regards to the differences of opinions with one police officer who is also the host of a TV show, who is no longer the host, and that's a whole separate story with how that worked out afterwards. That it seems as though what the executive wanted and what was actually happening, and there are other examples that we've seen outside of the JSC anecdotal evidence, that holding officers accountable to policies and regulations seemed to, not necessarily be something that was happening enough. And one of the other things now, on a similar vein, we just have a lot of indicators that our borders are porous, and we don't necessarily have any indicators that the Coast Guard is guarding anything. So
we have a whole barge and a tug and that came and over and spilled oil and left, and we can't find them up to now.
And then there may have been drugs on the tug, or in the middle of a national incident, a drug smuggler might have been able to slip through. One or the other is still bad, right? So I need to ask, is there any plans or intentions for the Joint Select Committee to have the other, because I think you all had some of the Defense Force staff on, but specifically for the Coast Guard to answer questions with regards to our border security, because I find now it's kind of ridiculous, especially since we've went through a pandemic with open borders. We have guns and drugs coming and human trafficking through open borders. We have a crime problem. I don't think we could solve, it's similar to the pandemic. We can't solve the internal problem if the waterfall, if the cascade of contraband still comes through.
And that's exactly the point that I raised with respect to the legal ports of entry as well, with customs, that you can't say that we need the police to get guns, and I sympathize with the police in terms of the guns are coming in through the legal ports, and when it gets on the streets, it's their problem. But we have to stem the tide of them coming in, because then we just like hamsters on a wheel. And the same applies to the drugs, the same applies to the human trafficking and so on. The same applies to the problem of illegal immigration. We have a tendency to put Band-Aids on, big, gaping, open wounds. And the Band-Aid with illegal immigration was to ask them to register. What has that done? Absolutely nothing. The Band-Aid that we tried to talk about when we talk about, then they said they're going to buy more vessels. Well, we've asked questions. There was one occasion when the Defense Force and some of the chiefs of all of the different areas, the Air Guard and Coast Guard, and then came to the Joint Select Committee. And I was very dissatisfied with the answers. They hide behind things like national security, so they can't answer certain questions. We don't know how many of these vessels are actually operational and what they are doing, because it really is amazing to me that we have vessels in our water, that you can have a whole natural disaster, not a natural disaster, a man-made disaster, ecological disaster occurring as a result of a mishap on the ocean. A barge of some sort or a tug could disappear, and we have no clue up to now who is operating and who's coming through our waters. I mean, this is frightening. It is totally, totally frightening, and it there's a lot of theories out there that this is a massive cover-up, and I don't blame the population for feeling that way. I feel the same way too.
Well,
I truly, truly do.
One of the things that I believe is the case in the United States, particularly with regards to security concerns, is that they will have like the Senate Committee on Intelligence, and some of their meetings are not for the public. So I get it. I can understand you don't want to reveal your deficiencies to the public, although one could argue the criminals know what the deficiencies are. The criminals know.
And the criminals are quite aware.
Right, but okay, let's just accept that, because my thing is, if there's a lack of patrolling, somebody needs to hold the various levels of authority to account, because it has to trickle down, right? And if the person in charge of the patrols ain't patrolling, then his service head needs to hold him to account. And if the Coast Guard is unwilling to hold its servicemen into account, then the head of the Defense Force needs to hold him into account, and so on and so on. But if we don't want to reveal this, is there a mechanism for the JSC to maybe have it behind closed doors, or maybe we should look towards having it?
Yeah, we can have in-camera sessions and when there's sensitive information. In fact, sometimes in writing, we ask them to submit information maybe of a sensitive nature. But if you speak to people who are involved in national security in this country, you would, I mean, they give the impression that, listen, our waters are being patrolled, this is happening, that is happening, so something is wrong. Something is very, very wrong. And, you know, it comes back to the fact of people, you know, again, there's hearsay evidence out there that, you know, there may be complicity on the part of some persons within the national security infrastructure. If it is you like me, you have bought all these vessels and you have these vessels out there patrolling and this is happening and that is happening. And still, we have this massive wash of drugs and guns coming into the country. Well, that tells me that the patrol is perhaps involved or turning a blind eye. You know, we're supposed to have a coastal radar that's supposed to be able to pick up vessels and so on coming into our waters. Why is this not happening? There was a point in time where we had vessels out there, and yet you would just see migrants coming ashore in droves. And where were the vessels? Where were the patrols? What was happening? Again, anecdotal evidence, you would hear that you would see national various arms of national security transporting illegal migrants away from the beaches and into the and inshore. And, you know, things that there really is a lack of, and it's not the little things. You mentioned that we talked about, you know, whether or not they were enforcing rules with respect to body cams and so on. I had asked as well about kit inspections, because we were seeing police marks, vests, and so on, police uniforms being used in certain crimes, and they are saying it's being replicated. You know,
they admitted some of the confiscated uniforms are authentic, which would imply that it's not just replications.
Correct. And, you know, and they're like, well, yes, we haven't had kit inspections, so we're going to do it. I asked at this follow-up meeting, well, how many kit inspections have you had? And I was like, okay, we'll have to get back to you now, we don't know. So what do? Sit in our office and send out a memo saying, okay, start kit inspections, because people are obviously lending out their uniforms and so on to bandits to imitate police and kidnap people. And then you don't even bother to find out if it's being done, how it's being done, what are the findings. You don't get reports. You can't tell us the results of us asking this question, asking you to do this. And to sit before a committee of parliament and say, well, there was a lapse in terms of enforcement of this. I mean, I would think that having to make an admission such as that your first order of business would be to then be able to, you know, ensure that the lapse doesn't take place. It's the same with the body cameras, and to report how many persons have been found in breach, and how many people have you disciplined for not using the body cameras when they're supposed to. How many people have done kit inspections and you know, have their kits are found deficient, and have you investigated? That's the type of information that the country deserves, and the mechanism through which they can get it is the JSC. So if you come before us and you say, I don't know, and you sit there with a blank expression, I can get back to you on that, I can find out about this, I can find out about that. Again, spitting top in mud.
Well, just to close, I do need to ask, and I mean, with regards to all of the things you just outlined with the police service, and also with regards to the fact that, as you said, and I'll say repeatedly, you know, we see the results with regards to our borders. So how could you tell me that there are patrols? Is that what comes after? Is there any follow-up? I assume with the police, you could maybe refer your findings to the Police Service Commission.
Well, the reports are laid in Parliament. Yeah, the reports are laid in Parliament, and at the end of the day, policy is really, and what we do is we inquire into policy and we identify deficiencies. And it's for the ministries to take it upon themselves and deal with those things. The police service is independent, yes, but they are operationally independent. But in terms of government policy, it's informed by the Ministry of National Security. So that's the next door, unfortunately, that we have to go knocking on when you do these examinations in terms of the Coast Guard, Air Guard, regiment, CTPS, all that, the port of call for action, quite unfortunately, lies at the doorstep of Minister Fitzgerald Hines. And I don't know if that inspires any confidence whatsoever in anyone, because I mean, I'm telling you, I honestly believe that at this point in time, the country, regardless of political affiliation or whatever, the entire country has reached a stage where they require some action to be taken at the level of the at ministerial level in terms of national security, and the country is very dissatisfied with the performance of this minister, and not just dissatisfied with his performance, but also very dissatisfied with the arrogance, the lack of the lack of willingness to accept that there's work to be done. There's a serious level of deflection in terms of responsibility, and I think that the time has really come when something has to be done there. Because if it is, we sit as a committee and we can ask all these questions, and we can have in-camera hearings, and we can write reports, and we can make recommendations, and we can expose deficiencies in the system, but it lands on this particular minister's desk and goes nowhere. Well, we are I feel just as frustrated as every other member of the public when it comes to this. And then the deflection that we hear about, when we talk, every time we talk about border security, we hear Kamala cancel the OPVs. It's been like 9 years. And if you're still going to talk about that, then you are totally out. You have lost control, and you are really just hanging on by a thread and looking to do cheap public relations to hang on to your job.
I will say this, when you mentioned the fact that I had to go to the Ministry of National Security, my first thought was not about the minister, but rather actually the ministry itself. I do wonder, I said we need to hold the services to account. What about the ministry itself? That whole existing body that seemingly we don't really see it do anything. And bureaucrats, I think, more and more also potentially part of the problem across the board and societal's problems.
Agreed.
But we don't know to what extent the ministry is deficient as well. We could see what the minister does or does not do and says or does not say.
But again, if there are deficiencies within your ministry, it's your responsibility as a minister to correct it.
That is true.
That's your part, your responsibility. So if the bureaucrats and so on within the ministry aren't functioning and aren't getting the job done, then the buck stops with the minister at the end of the day. So
that is true. He who sits in the chair has to take the blame and fall on his sword.
Correct.
Potentially.
So, just a little heads up, the next meeting of the Joint Select Committee, we will be having the electronic monitoring unit, because we were very curious to inquire into the efficiency of that unit and the ankle bracelets and the ability of someone to escape when they are put on the electronic monitoring. So that would be the next meeting to be held in a couple of weeks' time.
All right, thank you for that, Senator, and thank you for joining me and having this conversation. This is just one of those big problems, and we're just scratching the surface, but still, we appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for having me again. Have a good morning.
You too, Senator. Folks, we have to take a break. When we come back, we open the phone line. Stay tuned. This is Dr. Bono WSN, your content capital. We'll be right back after this.
The newest book is here, Closer to the Church, the debut novel by author and former mayor Louis Lee Singh. Available at all the home store branches, Barataria, West Mall, Shogunas and C3 San Fernando. Paper-based bookshop 10 Nook Avenue, St. Anne's. WESN 30A Gattaca Street, Woodbrook. Metropolitan Bookshop, Ariapita Avenue, Woodbrook, and all RIK bookstores nationwide. Available online as paperback on Amazon.com and Kindle for e-readers. For more info, call 628-5835 or 389-6504. Also available from author Louis Lee Singh, I Used to Live in Heaven, Letters to My Granddaughters, and Local Government in Trinidad, Conspiracy Against the People.
We are tackling the hard-hitting topics, some controversial topics, some topics we sweep under the rug. You don't always have to forgive in a relationship for it to move forward.
If it is you are in a situation where you forgive the person, but to the detriment of yourself, what are you really doing?
It is very uncommon for somebody in the younger age group to have dementia.
Atheists don't not believe. Is that I can't disprove God, but you also can't prove God. So we kind of at a stalemate.
You'll focus on the woman who's being the victim, right, or the man is being the victim. We exclude the children.
Folks are trying to study the underlying brain mechanism to figure out how does this particular disorder happen in the brain? How is the brain processing this?
Don't worry about AI. Worry about humans working with AI.
Are you willing to learn new skills to stay relevant for the future job market? That's the challenge that people are going to struggle with.
Welcome back to Talking About, ladies and gentlemen. Now is the time we open up the phone lines. We want to hear from you, the viewer. Have your say, ask your questions. Just please remember to mute your television when you're on the air. Don't listen to the TV. Listen to the conversation on the phone because there's a delay. With that said, we have our first caller already from Diego Martin. Good morning, caller. You're on the air.
Good morning. I appreciate I get into bowl the first ball. But before that, the books that you all advertising available at all bookstores, the Mr. Lee Singh books.
I'm entirely not aware. The ad literally just played. Okay. It listed the bookstores. I'm sorry. I can't remember which bookstores there are. I know they're available at the home store closer to the church. I don't know if there's other bookstores are also available at the home store.
Let me start off. Miss Jayanti Lakshmidiyal mentioned that they're always throwing the OPVs as an excuse how Kamala didn't buy and she shut down the order. Mr. Young and the Honorable Patrick Manning, Keith Rowley went to Australia and a couple of places to buy 2 OPVs. And what have that done? We had the oil vessel and the truck coming in. So that is back up, so that is a non-issue. More importantly, I want to talk about CARICOM and by extension our Prime Minister on his response to some questions about Trinidad music.
Yeah.
He's saying he's not going to ban it. My question to all of them, and this is where I'm saying the 4 estate is failing this country, and I'm broad brushing all media houses. The follow-up question to the Prime Minister should have been, because if you read all the articles, Irfan, the president of Guyana, Irfan Ali, said an artist has been banned by several CARICOM countries, St. Kitts, Grenada, and Guyana. And he was alluding to probably the artist from Trinidad. I'm not saying it's the artist from Trinidad. And what he said, that artist is on the red list, Interpol red list. If it's on Interpol red list and our national security and our police has some competency, they will see what a red list is. A red list say to arrest and bring forth to us. Interpol has all the information about that artist, and I suspect it's something big, and I suspect these artists facilitating gang creation and gang welfare within CARICOM. And none of the CARICOM leaders, including the former Skerrit, and I'm not too sure if Mr. Ali going to take action, because when that artist went into this country, they should have arrested him and passing him to Interpol. So our police continue to sleep, and the Prime Minister saying he going to not ban the music, he going to change the lyrics. Change the lyrics and nothing to do with it is that the lyrics currently in the music, that is what they want to hear. So it had nothing to do with that, so not banning it, because his Minister of Education say Trinidad music causing and facilitating the crime. The other thing I want to talk about is our AG. He's going to Zanzibar. What he's going to Zanzibar? He's going to Zanzibar for a digital conference on justice. We had in his office a digital issue with the missing files, the missing digital files. He has not put the report in the public. So what he's trying to fool us, what he's going to make the Stanley John report and the Nelson report to the people. Let me see as a citizen what went on. Because he has an issue, and he has told us in the LATTA conference that he has a memory problem, a memory episode. And I am saying if you have a memory episode, it's probably the same memory episode that's caused him not to put it into the public space. He probably forgot he has the file and somebody do a report on it. And my thing is about, my take on it, if he is going abroad, is somebody traveling with him in case he has a memory loss? Instead he go to Zanzibar, he going to somewhere else. So probably we have to facilitate him with some sort of guide. I'm not going to say which animal to carry with him. I'll go and have a nice morning.
Thank you, caller. Oh boy. All right. I don't know to what extent I could respond to everything that you said. To what extent it's tongue in cheek, and to what extent you actually were speaking literally and seriously with not just with the service animal, but with other things as well, like the memory lapse. I will say this: you're right, especially with regards to the Naipaul Kuhlman case file going missing. Where's the report on that? Where's the follow-up to that? Because you had a press conference to speak to the $20 million judgment. It seems as though because now that is being put forward towards the court to potentially try and overturn that decision, you decided less is more with regards to communication. But unfortunately, the incident did happen, the initial judgment did happen, your press conference did happen, and leaving us hanging, it's like, you know, having a movie trilogy and stopping at the second one. But instead of being entertainment, we're talking about something more important, right? The cliffhangers are not appreciated. We have a caller from Chaguanas. Good morning, caller, you're on the air. Caller, good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
I was reading this morning Express where Gregory Aboul, president of the Downtown Owners Merchants Association, is, yes, he's talking about the state of the capital city. And the first thing he talked about a parking and traffic plan. He seemed to forget that long ago, all these buildings in Port-au-Spain had to have parking. And these parking places have now been, the buildings have been extended to cover them. You have the East-West corridor where it entered, supposed to enter up Piccadilly Street and go up into Park Street where all the land was acquired, but people leave in context with it. Then he talked about local government reform, right? And I have already gone through this and showed the problem with local government reform is although the official reports say that government, local government taxation, land and building should pass to the regional authority, government did the opposite and took away that at the cities and boroughs. And finally, he blamed public servants because he says the salaries and pensions are guaranteed and they face zero accountability. Where he gets that from, I don't know. I have pointed out that every public servant has a supervisor who's supposed to put in an annual report, and these supposed to be used in dealing with promotions and disciplinary action. Right?
Yeah.
Any questions or?
Well, not so much a question, but just a statement. I actually agree with Mr. Aboud. I know that it's not supposed to be this way.
Which one? The three things you agree with?
No, not all three things. The last point.
Which one?
The last point.
The last one?
Yeah, I suspect what he said to be true. I know it's not supposed to be that way, but I think that's the result.
But that's not the public servant guarantee. He should say the ministers not doing the work.
Well, fair enough. I mean, maybe it's semantics, although you're technically very correct.
It's not semantics. If a minister is given a job of oversight,
yes,
oversight is to see that the job is done.
Yeah, but
they're supposed to put up annual administrative reports and they're not putting it up.
Yeah, but I think unfortunately the perception by the public servants.
I don't know reality. Everybody has their own perception in reality.
I have seen this before, this reality, where it is almost as, I don't want to say that they feel entitled, but it is almost as though they assume that.
But they feel entitled because the people who are supposed to provide oversight is not doing it.
Well, yes.
So you deal with the source of the problem. not the effect of the problem.
That is true. That is true. Thank you.
Still agree with it?
Yes, I agree with you with that. Yes, I agree with you there. That's why I said perhaps we are debating more semantics here. But your point of the cause, I believe, is very much true.
But that is any time you get a problem in life, you have to find out the cause. You can't solve it if you don't do that. You're putting plasters on flaws.
Yep. Thank you, Professor.
No.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, he is very much right with regards to that. The lack of oversight. I literally just had a conversation with a member of the Joint Select Committee on National Security, Opposition Senator Janty Lachumadial, where if I didn't spell it out or make it clear, my issue was the lack of accountability by the protective services, and the responsibility goes up the ladder. As somebody's not being held accountable, you go to the next level. Okay, are you going to hold the people underneath you responsible? No, you go to the next level. And with regards to the public service, at the end of the day, he's right. The politicians, they're at the top, and it filters down. Yes, the public service tries to be independent and whatever, but to some extent the situation is unhealthy, and we need the elected officials to, lead in whichever way they can, in whichever way they're authorized to fix the problem. We have a call on the line, I think San Fernando. San Juan, sorry.
Morning.
Morning, San Juan.
Yeah, how you going? I'm keep on drinking coffee in the backyard.
Probably.
Yeah, man. I cut in across a little bit on the attempted robbery on the tourist in town yesterday, boy.
Oh, okay.
Nice work by the police officers. But we need to have at least 10 years for robbing tourists when they come here. 10 years for offense. Right? Next thing is no bail for firearms like AR-15, war guns, rifles, extra clip with 9mm. No bail. Let us gang in the judiciary get serious and keep these fellas inside. That will help with the killings outside of the African butcher, right? Thirdly, lady you had earlier one day in the opposition, this is not trivial.
Yes.
She's innocent to the fact that when the opposition gang having their powwow to fuel the crime and criminals in this country, to bring the government down on that, and interfering with the ministry's operation, they are not doing the government and the ministers nothing. They are suffering the poor people. They are suffering the own UNC people. They are suffering the PNM people. And last of all, Mr. Griffith, GI, get yourself away from that clip. You will not know the nastiness plan coming down to election. Please, brother, come away from that. Good morning. Have a nice day, Sean.
Thank you, caller. Okay, a lot to unpack. I understand some of your initial points. I get it. The want to be harsh on criminals. I think at the end of the day, I will always start off with this. When the detection rate is so bad, the penalties don't matter because most of the perpetrators are not caught, right? And that really is the kind of like the gateway or the bottleneck of the problem. The penalties at the end kind of don't matter if I'll never experience those penalties. And 87% of perpetrators of murder or attempted murder, they don't, basically. That's more or less what the statistic more than just implies, because the police admit it's only a 13% detection rate. Now, with regards to the robbery for tourism, that's tricky, because I've pointed this out with regards to the policies that Mr. Cujo was being a proponent for. And I think you'll get something similar in this regard. At some point, people will forget who might have initially suggested this and pushed for this, right? And then what will happen is the population will eventually see, oh, so because they rob a white person from Europe or America, they had to get 10 years. But if they rob a black Trinbagonian, they only get in however many years or something like that. If I'm assuming the point that you're making is robbing foreign tourists needs to be higher. than a local robbery. And I understand why you're saying that, but I think society in the long run will forget the genesis, because I think that generally tends to happen. You forget the genesis of why these things were actually implemented, who called for them, what was the reasoning to call for them, and then you look at the result and you don't like the result, and then people start to say things like discrimination and racism and unfairness, etc., etc. Because I do believe that was part of the problems with regards to drug laws and penalties for certain drugs in the United States. People kind of forgot why the laws were instituted in the first place, and some of the proponents of said harsh laws. So that's the problem with harsh laws, right? So at some point, society no longer wants to stomach it. Now, maybe if you put a sunset clause in it, so it's at a limited time period while crime is kind of out of control, that might actually be a bit more practical. And I actually may even agree with you there. But I'm very hesitant with regards to, penalties for this crime with regards to if it's against this demographic is worse than if it's with regards to that demographic. I'm hesitant to do that. If the crime is bad, the penalty should be harsh across the board if we want it to be harsh. And perhaps maybe it should be harsh across the board, but then there will be individuals who might actually commit that crime, but may not, when you go down into the humanity of the situation, be completely deserving of the harsher penalty. That's part of the problems. The laws have to be objective and clear, and you can't have wiggle room if you want it to be clear, because then, it's complex. With regards to the firearms and no bail, I think that's an interesting suggestion, particularly because you're pointing out firearms with more potential firepower and lethality, automatic rifles, not just having larger clips, not just having the spray function, which could, cause a lot of collateral damage and innocent bystanders being injured or killed, as we have seen already. But there's also the fact that it penetrates better than a pistol round. So potentially, there's also the fact that, you think you're safe, but then somebody behind a wooden door or something gets hit with a bullet with significant force, not just a minor wound, in the crossfire. So that over-penetration, it might go through a car into a next car and injure a child or an old lady or an adult and potentially kill them. But then also, I think people might underestimate, because I believe in the United States, at least at some point, there was regulations against civilian pistols having clips that could hold more than 10 rounds. So that's an interesting point that you brought up there, because again, part of the issue we have is the collateral damage, is the people caught in the crossfire. And when you have more bullets, you tend to just spray things down. There's a greater chance of that for happening. So I actually don't necessarily have a problem with this, with having tight controls on the types of firearms, and then, of course, having harsher penalties for firearms that obviously are meant to be used in a confrontation that we don't want, a level of confrontation we don't want on our streets. But again, part of the problem is, will we be able to actually find all of these people? So far, when they get rifles, they don't get anybody. Usually, I think recently they had one case where they got a rifle and they arrested some people. But usually when they find these kinds of weapons, no arrests are made. And with regards to the big fines, one could argue the penalties for that already should be pretty harsh. I think if anyone is arrested with regards to our weapons, cash fine with multiple rifles and hundreds of rounds of ammunition, that definitely, I would think, should have no bail, right? But that's an extreme, obvious example. Your suggestion of found with a rifle, I think it does have merit. It does have merit. Why do you have something like that? It can be legal, and maybe the government should look at you and say, no bail. However, the next, or the flip side to the coin of why this is complex is, we need to do a better job of getting the court matters, criminal matters, through the system on a much quicker or reasonably faster, timely basis. Because if we say no bail, but then you're stuck for 10 years and the case falls apart, the state is going to get sued, potentially, right? Depending on the reasonableness of the case and the prosecution. Now, the last thing, caller, that you mentioned is with regards to, well, first of all, before I get into that, yes, obviously, the opposition Senator Janti Luchmedial, it's not as though she's been in the UNC for 20 years, right? And that's one of the things with regards to new politicians that that's why I have hope for them. They don't have the baggage of being there when some of the nonsense went down. That was the genesis or the seed of the problems that we have today. And as one caller pointed out with regards to the OPV vessels that the People's Partnership, you know, they terminated that deal. I think at this point, it's a moot question, I think, as the caller was trying to imply. Because the issues we have now is not just potentially questions on the availability and use of vessels, but I suspect we don't even have patrols. So it doesn't matter if we have the boats or not. The excuses of we don't have enough fuel or they're down for maintenance, those things could have applied for bigger, grander vessels with greater capabilities. What would be the point? You know, having more vessels and having bigger vessels if we're not sure that the Coast Guard are actually utilizing them as they're supposed to, that the systems are actually being put in place to hold them to account to ensure that they do their duties as they're supposed to. Of course, we don't have the details on what actually is happening. We just see the results. So it's still up in the air. I'll save my last point. We have a caller from San Fernando. Good morning, caller. You're on air. Caller, good morning.
Hey, morning, Sean.
Morning, morning.
You know, I listened to the discourse with the senator there.
Mm-hmm.
And while I agree with almost all that she talked about with respect to that Joint Select Committee and especially the police service, the last time the police service was there, it seems as if you look back at it in hindsight, that they may have just decided that they weren't going to, because they deliberately come unprepared. You know, you have to factor that in. However, what I want to get at is listening to the senator, and she seems to be saying all the right things. And I'm telling you, she is one that I appreciate on the committees when I look at it, on that committee. What bothers me is that you have she's part of an opposition that seems to be hell-bent on making the government of the day look bad. However, they still want to govern the country. You can't want to govern us and not seem to try to help the situation that is affecting us. And that is the problem I am having with all that nice talk from Mrs. Luchmedial. They need to get their house in order. You can't want to protect me by not protecting me.
Yeah.
You understand? Have a good day, Sean.
Thank you, caller. There's two things. I don't have much time. I'll try to be as quick as possible. Probably going to fail at it. But there's two things. One, I think political behavior has changed. Standards have changed. In part, it's our standards devolved. Standards of politicians abroad has devolved. And you get a similar phenomenon in North America where, you know, the two sides are basically saying, you're wrong, so I have to disagree and undermine you in every way, shape, or form that I can. And coming together to accomplish anything seems to be the exception rather than the norm, when it's supposed to be technically the other way around, ideally. Of course, depending on the situations and the emotions involved, the two sides aren't going to agree very easily. Fine, fair enough. With regards to TNT, we don't necessarily quite have the ideological differences, although after speaking to Dr. Kirkmehu last week from today, it did seem as though perhaps economically speaking at least, they do have a different viewpoint with the UNC being more deregulatory, hands-off, low government, and the PNM potentially being more big government, more regulation. So in some ways, it might mean that the UNC maybe might end up becoming, don't attribute this to the American politics, right? Don't equate this to that. More conservative, whereas the PNMs are more socialist. Or rather, the UNC may be more capitalist and the PNM more socialist. Let me put it that way, right? Now, with regards to the political messaging of the UNC and the lack of coming together with regards to the situation or trying to help To some extent, you're correct. I do think what the crime talks, neither side, I think, really put enough of an effort to get it done. If one side compromised its position for the sake of the talks to a greater degree than they have, because they didn't really, neither side didn't really compromise, I would have maybe given that side the benefit of the doubt, or even come out and said, well, look, I appreciate what they did there. I think they were trying, right? And it could have been a futile effort, but I want to see futile efforts. You do something that seems futile, so at the very least you can say, I did everything I could. It's the other side, right? But they don't do everything that they can, in part because I believe what's the point, you know? We all know this ain't gonna happen anyway, but then both sides look as though they're disingenuous. Now, the UNC undermining the national security situation on a whole, first of all, I don't think newer politicians have that much of a hand in it. That's point number one. Point number two, if that was the case, I think the Joint Select Committee would have been more political, which I don't think it is. And point number three, unfortunately, our political structure means that the people, you know, at the bottom kind of have to go along for the ride that the people on the top, whatever direction they decide to steer, right? And then the other thing too is, to what extent is it intentional? I think part of it as well, going back to the behavior of politicians, is as much as they're smart and they're educated and they're experienced, they're not always smart. They don't always have common sense. And to some extent, perhaps they are trapped now in this role that our political environment has put them in, or they have put themselves in, and they may not necessarily know how to get out of it. Because their base, if they try to do that, their base might feel as though they're being betrayed. And how could you now go back to the PNM to work with them when you've told us for months and years how vile and wicked and evil they are? You hypocrites! They have backed themselves into a corner. I think the PNM has done something similar, right? To what extent is it intentional? I hesitate to go there because the previous caller, that was his last point as well, and I was going to address that, Mr. San Fernando, you and Mr. San Juan. I hesitate to go there, right? Because usually the old adage, don't attribute to malice what could be attributed to incompetence. I don't know to what extent it's intentional. Maybe you're right. I don't necessarily have evidence to say that you're wrong. To what extent are all politicians involved in this? And not just involved, but how far or how deep is their involvement? I also don't know. This is a complex issue that's a far-reaching implication and accusation, depending on how you frame it, how you present it. Both callers presented it differently, right? So I'm not necessarily equating you all quite to be equal on this topic. You all touched on the same basic note, but unfortunately, I think I could try and have reasonable analysis and not necessarily go too far, but what both callers point out is a perception issue now on the opposition. And at the end of the day, the truth in some regards potentially matters less than what the population actually perceives, because at the end of the day, we'll never really know what the truth is 100%, but the perception is what is before us and what we think and feel when we go into the voting booths. Now, I'm way over time, so with that said, I still believe in TNT, despite all of the pessimism. There are still people working to keep this country moving forward. We just need to try to do better identifying them and then supporting them, right? And one of those things is with regards to the next general election. That's one of the avenues to do that. It's not the only one. There's a long time. It's a year away plus. There's a lot of work to be done, and it would not end there. We just need to be ready and willing. Part of it is to start identifying when, where, how we could get involved. Don't wait for the election. There's more political stuff that I want to speak about today. I'll probably speak about tomorrow. But as I said, I still believe in TNT. So to my fellow countrymen, make today a good day. As my coach always says, we will see you tomorrow morning. Bye-bye.
WESN.
Fan Zone, your reliable, authentic supplier, has just gotten better. You can now visit our website www.fanzonett.com for your authentic wear and collectibles. The only place where you can use both your Visa debit and credit cards. Visit our website fanzonett.com to make your purchase today.